So this exhibition by David Hockney is The Arrival of Spring Normandy 2020. And he executed this body of work, there's 116 of them, during the spring in 2020 in Normandy, in France. It also coincided, of course, with COVID, when the whole world was in lockdown. And David had intended to cover this subject again in Normandy for some time. He had explored the subject in two previous works, one in 2011, which he also did on the iPad, and then in charcoal in 2013. But when he went to Normandy in 2020 expressly to work on this group of works, he decided to do it once again on the iPad. And by this stage, the application that he had previously used had been adapted especially for him by a mathematician. So he was able to kind of feed into the abilities of this particular app various specifications that were kind of intrinsic to the way that he wants to work. So there were, he was able to design brushes for the particular mark making. He was able to determine the color palette, but he also was able to develop this new thing about working in layers, so that he was able to construct each image in a very different way, that he could pull out various aspects of the image and alter it and put them back in again. So when he was at the point of determining to go ahead with this very significant and ambitious project, he thought the iPad was really the only way to capture it. So all of these works were done in the garden of the house where he was staying. The house sits right in the middle of this land of 4 acres, and there's a variety of trees, there's a wonderful view, he can see countryside for miles and miles, so there's some wonderful aspects to be garnered from this garden. And he would forensically look at the landscape, at his garden, at the trees, at the bushes, and chart this changing progress that leads to the development of all plants right through to spring. And the coincidence of it happening during COVID is quite a remarkable one, really, because it was a period, when we look back on it now, it was a period when the world was plunged into this state of anxiousness. We didn't know what was going to happen. All we knew was that everything had stopped. And of course, David Hockney, by working on this body of work and telling us that spring was still happening, reminded us that actually you can't cancel nature. You can cancel everything else that impacts on humanity, but you really can't cancel nature. It will continue to develop in the way that it does every year. And one of the things that he did, which he often does, is during the progress of a piece of work, is he will send it to some of his friends as he's working on it. So I was one of the lucky recipients of one of these images almost every day during the lockdown period. And of course, this exhibition was put together relatively quickly in exhibition terms. Normally, institutions would spend many years programming and developing exhibitions, but because of COVID, exhibition programs had been completely upturned. So there were huge changes happening. And I was able to program this into the Royal Academy's exhibition program at very short notice, and then develop this tour which brings it here to Turkey. I understand that this is the first time that there is an exhibition of David Hockney's work in Turkey, and he's excited and I'm excited to be bringing it here to Istanbul. I think one of the things to point out when David is working on the iPad is that it's not, he's interested in technology, but he's not fascinated by technology for its own sake. He's interested in technology in what it can do to contribute to image making. And that's the thing that really engages with him. And you know, when you think about the work that he's done in the past using photography, but challenging the limits of photography, so therefore taking a myriad of different photographs of the same scene and putting it together so that you've got very different points of perspective. So it's kind of broadening what the camera would normally see. or looking at technology of the past, like the camera lucida, and identifying that that was a device that, that artists back to Angra might have used in their work, and exploring that whole kind of journey of artists looking through lenses to understand, to better depict nature. Those are things that have always interested him. But with the iPad, he sees it as a wonderful tool. And he makes the point that because he was capturing in this body of work such transient elements like the play of light, early morning light, moonlight, also things like that kind of very fleeting mistiness that you get in the morning, he made the point that you have to get that down quickly. You have to get that onto the iPad and draw that quickly, and then the rest can follow. With an oil painting, it works the opposite way around. That comes as the kind of final layer. But with the iPad allowed him to kind of get that particular atmosphere, capture that, and then fill in the rest later. But having said that, the iPad itself is not a shortcut. He would spend the same amount of time working on the iPad as he would working in oil or acrylic on canvas. The way he's able to save time is not having to set up all of the paraphernalia, so not having to get the canvases out and mix the paints and move the canvas and everything to certain locations in the garden. But he's got that mobility of having the iPad, switching it on and working immediately on it. And that was the thing that was invaluable to him. And I mentioned earlier about this ability to work in layers, which is kind of very complicated to keep in his head, but he's very adept at doing that. So he would create these kind of back layers that he was able to amend and adapt as he went along, and literally pull those out, alter them on the iPad and slide them back in. And the other thing that he was able to do was that you see in this exhibition that the images are quite big, considerably bigger than an iPad. And he knew when he started this body of work that he was going to eventually print the work to show in exhibitions like this at this particular size. So when he was composing the work, when he was making all of those marks, he knew what size the image was going to finally be. So that dictated how he made those marks and the thickness and the quality of those marks, because it was going to be shown on a much bigger scale. So that was a lot to keep in his head. What the exhibition really tells us is the whole narrative of the arrival of spring. And there's a few things to bear in mind when we think about Hockney's influences. His knowledge of history of art is vast and deep. And of course he approaches it not as an art historian, but as an artist, which is a very, very interesting perspective for us, because he sees art history in a way that maybe an art historian doesn't see it. He sees it in a much more visceral way. And also always asks those questions about what did they see? And how did they do that? And it's fascinating to have conversations with him around those subjects. But when he was in France, it wasn't lost on him that he was there in Normandy, which is very much the birthplace of French Impressionism. And of course, French Impressionism was all about giving that intimation of nature, but doing it directly from nature. So it wasn't studio based. They were outside, they were looking at the environment, they were trying to give a sense of place to their works and kind of embed that atmosphere within their paintings. And he isn't terribly far in Normandy from Giverny, which is Monet's garden. And David makes the observation that Monet had many, many springs to depict in Giverny, which he did beautifully, of course. And David is rather envious of the time that Monet had there. But in addition to Impressionism, he's quite, the place that he stays in Normandy is quite close in location to the town of Bayeux, where of course they have the wonderful Bayeux tapestry. And it was an artwork. I mean, David considers it an artwork, but he first discovered this in the 1960s, but has really got to know it very, very well over the years that he has spent in Normandy, and is fascinated by it. And one of the things that he notes about it is that it's a narrative. It tells the story of this remarkable battle. So embedded in it is this sense of a narrative which gives us time, but also embedded in it is all of the time that each of the individuals who were embroidering that work gave to the work. So it's kind of wrapped up in that piece is this sense of not only the man hours that people take to make the work, but this sense of the time through the narrative of the story that's been told. And this exhibition here, the Hockney exhibition of the arrival of spring, also has both a sense of narrative and a sense of time. So the exhibition is arranged largely chronologically. So we start in winter with the trees without any leaf. And what unfolds is this wonderful story that we all get to read every year if we observe spring. It tells this wonderful story of how spring arrives, how the trees begin to change color, the buds come out, the green of the grass becomes much more vivid, and everything is enriched with this rebirth, this annual event of rebirth and regeneration. But also it's about the passage of time. It's another year. It marks another year in our calendar. It marks another year in the agricultural calendar. And it marks a period of time from February to right through to the early summer. And all of that is embedded in these particular works. So when David first started this body of work, I've already talked about the iPad and how important it was to allow him the mobility and the speed to be as ambitious as this. But it's very akin to drawing and painting, and of course they wouldn't be successful if he wasn't a fantastic painter and draftsman. And his experience of working on paper, on canvas for 60 years is very much embedded in all of these works. So it doesn't make an indifferent painter. What I'm saying is an iPad doesn't make an indifferent painter a good painter all of a sudden. It doesn't quite work like that. It's just another set of tools that a good artist can use in a positive way to create a great work. And David would spend about the same amount of time on these works as he would in a normal canvas. And one of the things he's kind of says about the history of art is that, well, you know, Van Gogh would have liked the iPad, and so would Monet, for the same reasons that he likes it. This ability to be completely portable, the sense of color, the variety of the color range that you can get from them is really remarkable and something that he's very interested in. And within his overall oeuvre, these works are not remarkably different to the paintings that he's done of similar subjects. You can see that he's developing, so if we look back at his work 10 years, 20 years, we can certainly see how he's developing as an artist, which is remarkable in itself given his age. He's now 84, due to be 85 in July. And you know, you can see that development happening all the time. What you also find with him is that he often works in different media, and when he goes back to a previous medium like painting, which he's doing now, his mark making has been slightly altered by his focus on the iPad for quite a considerable period of time. I just want to point out a few things to look out for in the exhibition. I mean, I've already said it's hung largely chronologically because it is telling the narrative of the spring. So we start in at the end of winter and we go through to early summer, so that whole period is charted. But here at the Sabanci Museum, one of the things that we have focused on is finding those moments where David Hockney is depicting the same scene, the same tree, or exactly the same view, and by putting them together, you really chart how those changes have been captured by him during that period. So it kind of gives us this great insight into the development of the season as it progresses. There's also an interesting video work which shows him working on the iPad in quick time. So you will see how the image has been built up. So he draws the very bare outline of the tree, and then everything else is filled in around it, the background, the foreground, the branches of the tree, then the leaves and the blossom at the end. And it's speeded up. I think it probably takes it puts 8 hours or so into a minute, but it's fascinating to see that sense of his hand and his thinking as to how he's creating that composition. There's also some wonderful evening scenes where we see the night sky and the moon and various kind of versions of the moon from its waxing and waning. And he points out as well that these were works that he was able to do from his bedroom window. And it wouldn't have been possible with oil painting or drawing, because you would have required artificial light, which would have changed your view or obliterated it completely. But with the backlit iPad, it made that very possible. And I've mentioned 2 artists in already, and one was Monet. And there is a sort of homage to Monet in a couple of places in the exhibition. One is David's depiction of the pond in his garden, and there's water lilies in the pond, as there are, of course, at Giverny, and depicted many, many times in Monet's Nymphéas. And David is looking at the same scene. But what's so interesting always with Hockney, when he depicts water, when we think back to the swimming pool pictures that he first did in the 1960s, which were amongst the pictures that really put him into the public consciousness, he's got this wonderful ability to really evoke a sense of water. And he talks about water being such an interesting plane to work with, its reflective qualities, its depth. All of those things he describes so brilliantly in these particular works. And then the other Monet reference is Monet's series. When we remember those series that Monet did of the haystacks, of Rouen Cathedral, where he's looking at the same scene with very different light, and how it alters it considerably when you've got this different play of light across the composition or across the building. And David also does the same thing in a series of iPad works where he's looking at exactly the same scene and the setting sun. And you have this wonderful variety of light patterns that work through that series of works. And then Van Gogh is so much evoked here in the kind of that love of landscape, the joy of colour. There's a group of paintings in particular. Again, it's showing the one scene, the one tree changing through the season. The fig tree, which is in the final gallery here, and it's very, very evocative of Van Gogh, particularly those paintings that he made in the south of France, where you have that sense of the beauty of nature, those hot colours, and how the sun has kind of communed with the earth to create this wonderful palette, and that's very, very present in David's work as well. So ultimately, I think this exhibition is just unbelievably joyful. It reminds us how wonderful nature is, how nature kind of continues regardless of all of the things the complicated things that are happening in the world, and how it should be a source of great pleasure to us. And I think one of the things that David does in his work is to teach us how to look. He looks in a very forensic way at the landscape, and he's encouraging us to do the same thing. And I think we kind of leave with a sense of joy. It's a very uplifting exhibition in many ways. So I hope that people will be able to come and enjoy it. It opens here on the 11th of May and it closes on the 29th of July.